Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective podcast. On Tuesday of this past week, December 30th, 2025, we filmed an episode with the former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, Carlos Ron, and Dr. Mohammad Marandi, professor at the University of Tehran. It was a roundup of U.S. imperialism, of anti-imperialist efforts around the world to wrap up the year. Just a few days later, Saturday night, the United States invaded Venezuela and kidnapped President Maduro and First Lady Flores. And they just recently, yesterday or last night, arrived to New York City to stand trial. So we brought both of our esteemed guests back to discuss what has happened. We believe in AISC that Venezuela is one of the pillars of anti-imperialism around the world, and especially in the Western Hemisphere. And we support the Bolivarian Revolution. And we call on all of our friends and supporters around the world to stand strong in support of President Maduro, in support of First Lady Flores, and defend the Bolivarian Revolution. Carlos, I'll pitch it to you now. Thank you both for joining us again. And we did intros. You'll see in the next episode, the attached episode, the introductions that we did.
Well, thank you, Nina, and again, a pleasure being here with you and with my friend, Professor Marandi. In the early hours of January 3rd, we were attacked by the United States of America. There was a military intervention against our country, what we had been talking about. I mean, we discussed the possibilities that this is something that could have happened, and actually did happen. If there was several missiles were shot from sea to air to land, and attacked several places in the national territory. 4 states were attacked: the states of Miranda, La Guaira, and Aragua, as well as the city of Caracas. And in the city of Caracas, you had a zone called Fuerte Tiuna, which is a military fort, but it's embedded in a larger locality, which is Ciudad Tiuna, or Tiuna City, which is also inhabited by civilians and military personnel. So it's a combination of both. As a matter of fact, it's important for your audience to know that this city was created as part of the housing program that the Bolivarian Revolution has created in the last several years to fight the lack of homes that the people of Venezuela were suffering. A lot of the houses that were built in this area were part of those projects that were given to workers, working class people, free of charge. The people that used to live in favelas and shanty towns now were able to move into these residences. These residences were also hit during the attack as they were trying to also hit military targets. So I say this because I don't want anyone to get that perception from the U.S. narrative that this was an operation that was was very kinetic and very they just came in, took the president and left. That's been a narrative. No, every time the United States intervenes militarily in a country, it's a devastation. It attacks a sovereign country. It violates international law, but it also has a real affectation on the lives of civilian population. There's no way that doesn't happen. There's no bombs that only choose criminals or that only choose people that the U.S. doesn't like. I mean, there's no bombs that prevent these types of catastrophes from happening. Okay, so it's important that people understand that, and fight that narrative. Also, it is important to know that out of this incursion that we're talking about, not only were these targets hit and these casualties that we mentioned, there was also the most importantly, the president was kidnapped, abducted by U.S. forces, along with his wife, who's a deputy of the National Assembly, Cilia Flores. They were taken, and they were, like you said, they were brought to the United States to stand trial, probably on all these made-up charges that they have been working on for several years now, and trying to create this narrative that this is this was a head of a criminal operation. And it's important also to point that out, because this is something that has been building up since this whole year. We saw first the accusations of President Maduro as having ties to the Tren de Aragua, which is a criminal gang. Then they decided that no, it's better to have ties to a Cartel de los Soles, which again these are non-existent organizations, but they create this myth about these organizations. So now it's a drug trafficking organization. The Zionists also added their 2 cents into the accusations and said, of course, that Venezuela had tied with terrorist organizations and so forth. So all this to justify a military intervention into Venezuela. A military intervention whose purpose was to decapitate the government of Venezuela, to recapture the U.S. Influence over the Venezuelan oil industry, and to give a sense for the rest of Latin America, or even for the rest of the world, that you cannot mess with the United States, because the United States is going to carry these type of operations out. But it is an act of war what took place. It's an act of war because it's an invasion of a sovereign country, and it's an act of war because it affected civilian population. Anyone that is trying to say that this is not an aggression, this is not an act of war, this is just a police type operation, is completely wrong in this side of the setting. So I wanted to make sure that the audience needs to understand this, because this is critical. This is part of what they're trying to use to justify interventionism, even to the U.S. base, to the MAGA base, because we understand that a lot of the Trump base is anti-war or anti-interventionism, but they're using this as a crime or as a police type of operation just so that they can justify what they want. But what they really want, again, is the oil. And I'm not making this up. President Trump gave a press conference right after these events yesterday morning. And what does he say in this press conference? Is, we are going to run the country. We're going to run the country. We're going to get the oil. I mean, about half of the conference was spent on talking about Venezuela's oil, and not President Maduro, the charges, whatever you want to talk about. So I think it's important. Let's drop the farce. Let's talk about what this is really about. This is about Venezuelan oil. This is about Venezuelan resources, and about trying to impose a regime change operation. That being said, I also think it's important for people to know that a regime change operation did not take place. And I say this because today, the president of Venezuela is Nicolas Maduro, and he's a president that has been abducted by the United States. But he is the one and only president of Venezuela. And his whole cabinet, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, the rest of his cabinet, the rest of his ministers, the rest of the heads of the armed forces, the rest of the state institutions are still in place. We are in a city, I'm talking to you from Caracas. This is a city that this morning, is in a situation of calmness, because there's still the control by the state institutions of the country, and that's also important to know. Now, these allegations that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela, all this that President Trump said, well, for that to happen, either they did threaten with another attack, because he did spend some time in his intervention just saying that that there could be a possibility of another attack. And obviously, if they are to control that, they would have to do this, because right now the control is on the hands of the constitutional authorities of Venezuela, and the Supreme Court of Venezuela has instructed that the vice president be temporarily sworn in as president. I mean, she has this obligation. She's in charge of the presidency while the president is abducted, but he is the president. And this allows for the continuity, administrative continuity of the process. There's no vacuum. There's no uprising. There has been no change of government. There is no U.S. control. There's no U.S. puppet regime. None of that has taken place. So it is very important, and I say this, as an appeal to international solidarity. First, that we understand this, and second, that we defend Venezuela and Venezuela's institutions, and demand the respect for Venezuela's institutions, and demand the restitution of President Nicolas Maduro as a kidnapped president, because it is important that the world understands that Venezuela is still, defending its revolution, is defending its political process, and is defending its way of life. I think those are that is perhaps the most important overall summary, I guess, of what has happened. But in this, we must say, it was an overwhelming show of force by the United States. I mean, the United States is obviously, there's no doubt, is the main military power in the world. I mean, over 100 aircrafts flew over Caracas yesterday morning. There was missile launches. There was, all of the president's security team was assassinated. I mean, just a few minutes ago, before we came into this conversation, the Minister of Defense gave an address to the nation, where he confirmed that most of the security team, almost all of the security team of the president, was murdered during this operation. So we have to again point out that of the brutality of the violence that was used by the United States to attempt regime change in Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Before I ask Dr. Marandi to jump in, we've been hearing a lot, especially those of us that are on social media, about Venezuela's readiness. Over the last several months, the revolutionary forces have seemed like that they've gotten ready for a U.S. invasion. And it looks like if the U.S. does send troops or does another round of attacks, the people of Venezuela are ready for armed struggle and to defend their revolution. Can you talk about that a moment, please? And then we'll get Dr. Marandi to jump in here.
I mean, so yes, so this we have to understand in relative terms, because, I mean, on one side, yes, Venezuela has been getting ready for defending the revolution. The Venezuelan military has prepared, of course, for a scenario like this. But Venezuela is a peaceful people. Venezuela is not a state, that has promoted wars, that has built up for war. This is actually not part of our political culture. The last time Venezuela fought an international war was in 1821, when we finished the Battle of Carabobo against the Spanish. I mean, then until 1825, we helped liberate, the other countries in the region. But we have never been in such, an international conflict. So, whichever attempts that Venezuela may have to resist, and there were, and we had there were air defenses that went into effect. There were soldiers that very courageously are wounded and lost their lives trying to defend the country. We're talking about a massive U.S. intervention, a massive military power display, and of course we're not at that level, because we're not a warmongering country, because we're not a country that spends most of its budget in war expenditures rather than social expenditures. We cannot expect Venezuela to be ready for such a massive display. That's not to say that there's no willingness to defend the country. That is not to say that there wasn't a lot of courageous, and let me tell you that they were. There's some accounts that have come out of people. I mean, you are moved to tears when you listen to the soldiers, how they try to stand this attack by the United States. Even I heard this morning a testimony of one of the soldiers who's in the hospital saying, how even he wanted to remain in his post. He was taken to the hospital and he wanted to remain in his post and defend, from the attack, because that's the courage that you get. But again, we're talking about a monstrous machine, a monstrous military machine, that is there. And, Venezuela doesn't have again, doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's never thought about war in those terms, because we have always built our policy, our foreign policy, as a country of peace. We believed in dialogue. I mean, we are with Iran. We're part of the group of friends of the UN Charter. We have tried for so many avenues to employ diplomacy, dialogue. This is not a country. This is a country that has a fighting spirit. This is a country that has a legacy of liberation. But this is not a country that was made or created for war, for destruction and for violence, like the United States, unfortunately, has been in the last several years with the administrations that it has.
Yeah. Well, I would say last many centuries since the settlers first arrived to the Americas. But yeah, I understand. I want to pull Dr. Marandi in as a nation that was also just as a faculty member at a university in a nation that was just recently invaded by U.S. imperialism and its proxy in the form of Israel. Please feel free to jump in.
I think the interesting thing is the three of us have been in all three countries, in the United States, in Venezuela, and Iran. So we see the similarities. Actually, there are striking similarities between Iranians and Venezuelans, which may surprise some. Contrary to the foolish claims made in Western media or the disinformation, Venezuelans they believe in Christ, they believe in God, but their Christ supports the oppressed, the real Christ, like our Christ. So Jesus supports the oppressed, supports the victims, and the neocons and the Christian Zionists, it's not Christ. Whatever they pretend to be Christ supports genocide and aggression. So the real Christians are in Venezuela, and those in the United States and the West who oppose this disgraceful behavior. There are only a couple of things that I'd like to say. One is that actually I think I was telling Ron during the airstrikes, or when we're speaking, or maybe afterwards, that in Iran the first few hours are confusion and people are wondering what's going on. But then when things settle down, people become, they know what to do, they become steadfast, and that's when the enemy recognizes that they've lost. And I believe that the same is true in Venezuela. And Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, but this Nobel War Prize winner, Trump did not support her, in my opinion, only because he knew that if he did, he would have to send her to Venezuela, and then he would have to put boots on the ground. And if he did that, that would be where the Venezuelan people have the upper hand. Because, of course, the United States can carry out airstrikes. They have far more advanced technology than Venezuela. They've sanctioned Venezuela, like Iran, for decades to try to impoverish the country as much as possible. So they are, of course, the biggest military power. Their economy is not doing well, but they still have the biggest military power. And they had a huge armada. So bombing Venezuela, murdering people in the dead of night, which is the height of terrorism. It's what the Israelis do. They like bombing at night to create fear and confusion. So as Carlos said, the government's in place. The acting president is there. The current president, he's a hostage. His wife is a hostage, but the administration is intact. The country is given martyrs. And I do not believe at all that the United States or Trump will succeed in Venezuela. In fact, I think he's digging himself deeper and deeper into a hole. That's one thing. The second thing is that at this time, and the same is true with Iran, the United States and its proxies and its media and its Spanish media, just like its Persian media empire that's against Iran, they and their spies and their assets, they will promote conspiracy theories. They will try to create division, try to create fear among the people, mistrust. This person who was helping the Americans, who betrayed the country. This is something that we should stand against, those of us who are active online. all of this is just sheer speculation made up out of nothing. But some people may just be doing it on their own, but there's an agenda behind this. And we've always seen the same thing in Iran. Whenever the West tries to create unrest, or whenever they want to launch a war, or whenever they want to hurt Iranians, it is accompanied with a media campaign. Both mainstream media and online media, alternative media, they have their own media because they control everything. They control social media platforms. They control the mainstream media, of course. So this is something that Venezuelans and those of us who support the Venezuelan people should keep in mind. We should not be spreading rumors that we know nothing about and where there's no evidence to prove them. It only serves the purposes of the Trump regime. What we have is an acting president who was close to the current president. We have a cabinet that was close to the president. And most importantly, we have a people who are outraged. And again, Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, President Maduro's popularity today is probably unprecedented. And the United States is more despised, not just because of the murder, not just because of the terror attacks at night, but because of the words said by Trump himself. His press conference was probably the ugliest press conference, the most disgusting press conference I've ever seen. It was difficult to tolerate. A thug was speaking, and he basically was saying that I own Venezuela. It is mine. The oil is mine. We will buy and we will sell and we will. People are not going to accept that. And not only are Venezuelans not going to accept that, but people across the world are watching this. People across Latin America are watching this. And they're saying, is this what he wants for us? So I think that the United States has made a catastrophic mistake. I do believe that there'll be tough times ahead for Venezuela. In Iran, we had tough times too, and maybe in future we will have tough times. But the regime in Washington will definitely fail.
I have to agree with you, and I have to say that just to touch on the issues that you mentioned, it is true. I mean, the same idea, or the same attempts of division, like you said, rumors. But you see how the New York Times has opened with with an article on saying, how there was complicit. Somebody from inside gave him in without giving any names or anything like that. But that's so that we start looking at each other and say, well, who did it? Who was the one that gave him up? And and you start, because you need that division to break what they couldn't break. You need to break the morale of the Venezuelan people. And like you said, the images of President Maduro coming in, just his aura of
standing tall, or when he gave the thumbs up.
Yes. And when he comes in, he says, good night, Happy New Year, and he asks, how do you say it? I mean, just the fact that is a man that has nothing to hide, that is a man that has a clear conscience.
He's not afraid.
The ones that are bringing him up are the ones that are nervous, not him. That shows a lot of dignity, and that was a very important impact on the Venezuelan people last night when we were able to see those images. And Trump himself, going back to this Peace Prize winner, Trump himself left her to out in the cold yesterday, when he said during the press conference, well, she's a nice lady, but she can't run the country. But she has no support to run the country. So he's recognizing what we said all this time, that this is not true. They do not have support. This extremist opposition called for this invasion. The talk yesterday in the streets was, people were so angry, upset. Even those who didn't believe that this could happen. At one point, it's all politics. Now that they realize that the United States has come in and attacked Venezuela because of the people like her asking for an intervention. Well, now the vast majority of Venezuelans, whether wherever they stand on politically, they're rejecting this interventionism, and
because she's complicit in the bloodshed.
Of course, and any of them that called for this, would never have a political future in Venezuela, because the people will never forget that it was their treachery, it was their calling for intervention that led to this, to this horrible experience that we had last night or 2 nights ago. I don't know, but it's true. You can't be so viciously, egotistic that you would sacrifice the people that you're supposed to represent or that you want to lead. You leave them out to be sacrificed by imperialism just for you to have your own gains. People know. People are not dumb. People know. People will forever hold hold them responsible for this.
Well, we need to wrap up because Carlos has to run, but do either of you have any final words before we wrap?
No, I just would like to ask everyone who's watching to be active online, to always remember that the president of Venezuela is being held hostage by the regime in Washington, and that the people of Venezuela are peaceful people. They have not provoked war. The United States has been using one excuse after another to antagonize the people. Their only sin, like the Iranians, like the Axis of Resistance, like all other people who across the global majority who the Americans antagonize, is simply because they just want to be in charge of their own country. They want to be in charge of their own assets. They don't want to be a part of anyone's empire. And that is an unforgivable sin.
Yeah, and I have to say, again, it's important for people to accompany Venezuela during this process. During the next few days, it's going to be critical for us to have international support and defense for Venezuela's institutions, constitutionality, for the defense of President Nicolas Maduro and for Cilia Flores as well. I think it's important to remember that they have rights too, and they have been illegally abducted, and those rights, we must demand that those rights are respected as well. And I have to say, my brother, that after seeing, going through that experience, my respect for the people of Iran grows even, higher than ever. I mean, it's one thing to theorize and to talk about this in the terms that we do when we haven't undergone an invasion, an attack of the sort. And I know Iran has been through a lot in its history, in its recent history, through war, through attacks, the terrible attacks that we saw even this year, it's just a big sense of admiration for the people of Iran to still hold their ground, to still hold their position in defense of their own interests, of their own future. And I think that look what imperialism does. It brings together. This is what it does. It brings people together in the feeling of defense of sovereignty, of defense of the right to craft your own future. And so appreciate Iran's solidarity with Venezuela and everyone's solidarity, because this is the moment when this is most needed, and this is a moment where we will also want to let you know that in Venezuela we are going to continue to struggle to defend our process, to defend our rights, because we don't do it for ourselves the same way that Iran doesn't do it for itself. We do it because every time a people defend their own rights, they're defending the rights of all other peoples around the world that are fighting for their own sovereignty and their real freedom. So thanks again.
Carlos, you brought us to tears. You brought me to tears. I'll say, having had the privilege of visiting both countries, my family's from Iran, and I visited Venezuela, and that's where I met Dr. Marandi. Both of those peoples are revolutionary peoples, and they will defend their revolutions. There's no question. There is no question about that. The U.S. can do as many decapitation strikes as it wants. It can remove as many people as it wants. It's going to have to completely destroy those countries to destroy their revolutions. And that's not possible. It's just not possible. And the overwhelming force with which it invaded Venezuela 2 nights ago is a show of U.S. weakness. It wouldn't have needed to do that. It wouldn't have needed to do that just to take 2 people if it were as strong as it was in 1995. So you'll see in the next episode that we recorded a few days ago before the invasion of Venezuela, our discussion about the end of U.S. imperialism and the fall of U.S. imperialism. So I encourage you to stay on. That episode is a bit longer, a bit lighter, and hopefully we'll come out of this. Both nations will come out of this. The global majority, the peoples of the world will come out of this stronger, happier, and in charge of their own destinies. Thank you, as always, to our viewers. Thank you very much to Carlos for making time for this at an otherwise challenging time. Thank you to Dr. Marandi, and thank you to Sina Rahmani, our producer. Signing off.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyways, welcome to the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective podcast. We are doing this at the end of the year, so we're going to try to do like a year-end wrap-up. And I am honored to be joined by 2 people that I count as friends and colleagues. The former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, Carlos Ron, and Dr. Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran. It's actually funny that we're here together because Venezuela actually brought us together several years ago. Dr. Marandi and I were at a conference in Venezuela. Not a conference, actually. We were election observers during the presidential elections a few years ago. And we met there. So really, it was Carlos and his beautiful nation that brought us together. So I'm truly honored to be here with you both. I'm also grateful, as always, to Sina Rahmani for producing our podcast, which is a work in progress. But let's get started. So we're here basically today to do a roundup of the year, specifically with folks from 2 nations that are directly targeted by U.S. imperialism, the worst of U.S. imperialism, and have managed not only to survive, but to thrive. So we're going to start with that roundup. Maybe Dr. Marandi will start with you. What do you think is the state of U.S. imperialism today, both vis-a-vis Iran and around the world?
Well, first, I'd like to congratulate everyone for the new year. I hope everyone has a good year ahead of them, despite all the problems. And I hope everyone had a Merry Christmas, and our Armenian sisters and brothers and Orthodox Christian sisters and brothers who will be celebrating next week, a Merry Christmas to all of them as well. I think it's pretty clear. Iran and Venezuela, 2 very wonderful countries with very wonderful people. I've had the honor of being to Venezuela on multiple occasions, and my first invitation actually came through Carlos. We met in Tehran, and he kindly invited me to Venezuela, and I was very impressed by the country, which has not just survived, as you pointed out, but thrived under very difficult sanctions, something that most people across the world really can't understand and comprehend, how sanctions affect individuals, families, communities, how it kills people, how they destroy families and lives. People lose their jobs, families fall apart, children fall into poverty. This is what sanctions are all about. They're not about targeting leaderships or ministers. They're about targeting ordinary people, trying to strangle them as much as possible so that they kneel, so that they give up and they turn against their government, so that the empire will get its way and remove their boots off their necks. That's what sanctions are all about. That's what they did to Nicaragua in the 1990s, and that's how they had the Sandinistas removed from power. They made life so miserable that people, out of desperation, voted for the fanatic right-winger who was affiliated to the United States. But soon afterwards, despite the United States supporting the regime, people moved back to the Sandinistas. Why? Because under normal circumstances, people don't want to be associated with these Western-backed despots who, just like now the Nobel War Prize winner of Venezuela, or regime change prize winner, I don't know which one it is. I don't remember the real name or the first name, but she's despised in her own country because she's advocating the bombing of her own people and the subjugation of her own people by a foreign power. The same is true in Iran. But I think the world has changed significantly. We're all, I think, at least me and Carlos, are old enough to remember the 1980s, the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the United States became effectively the hyperpower, and we'd reached the end of history. And even though the author of that article and book later sort of backtracked, but that feeling, that sense existed across much of the world that we had indeed reached the end of history, and that the United States was going to be the power, this hyperpower, the superpower that we would have to live with for the rest of our lives. But the United States, through its own, meaning the regime in Washington, through its own stupidity, its endless wars, and the antagonism that it has shown towards so many different countries across the world, it has gradually weakened itself and marginalized itself. So whether it's trade wars with China or even India or even Brazil, or whether it's the endless wars starting from Afghanistan, then Iraq, Libya, now of course Ukraine, or the dirty wars such as in Syria and Libya, all of these have in one form or another depleted the energy and the power of the United States. The war against Iran, of course, the 12-day war. And so today, I think when we look at the United States itself, and again, you and Carlos know more about the United States than I do. Carlos, you of course are in the United States, but Carlos knows the country much better than I. The United States today, its middle class is evaporating. The economic situation is not good. Trust has collapsed. People don't trust the state. And of course, I'm not speaking in absolute terms. I'm speaking in relative terms. Epstein and how it has discredited the president, the political elites, and the oligarchs, and of course the genocide in Gaza, among other things, including the ongoing bombing of boats in Venezuela and killing people without providing any evidence at all that they are carrying drugs in those boats, which, even if they all were, which I find it impossible to believe, these are illegal killings. These are murders anyhow. They have no right to carry out these murders, whether in Venezuelan waters or in the Caribbean, or whether it's in the Pacific or anywhere else in the world. But this has also created anger among many Americans. The polls that I saw a few weeks ago showed that 70% of Americans are opposed to what's going on in Venezuela. I haven't seen anything newer, but I assume that's the general mood in the country. So the United States has more than enough trouble at home. And the same is true with Iran. In Iran, Americans are not happy with Netanyahu. They're not happy with Zionism. They're not happy with Israel, the Israeli regime. And of course, the United States does not have the power that it had before. If it did, Venezuela would have collapsed by now. Iran would have collapsed by now. And they haven't. And in fact, the United States is so, and again, I'm speaking about the regime. The United States is so stupid that the president of the United States goes out and says, we want our oil back. We want our land back. And then what does that tell ordinary Venezuelans who may be sitting on the fence? It tells them, no, we don't want this. They're already saying that they're going to steal our country from us. So this is how crude the empire has become. I mean, Obama was no better than Trump, and Clinton was no better than Obama, and Bush was no. They're all the same, but they were more sophisticated in their hypocrisy. They would never have used this sort of language to speak about Venezuela or Iran or Syria or Iraq or anywhere else, or Gaza. But the decline of the empire is also reflected in the behavior and the language used by the president, by senators, by congresspeople, by the media. The media today, whether it's the BBC or Fox News, whether it's Sky News or the New York Times, they've become much more crude in the way in which they're depicting the world as it is. And that is why not only across the world do they no longer have any credibility, but even Americans don't trust them anymore. Americans who are the most propagandized people in the world.
Thank you, Dr. Marandi. And I completely agree. The desperation with which the U.S. government is currently operating is bizarre on the one hand, but it's a reflection of the death of the empire. And I think, it's just a matter of time before. I think it's going to happen in our lifetimes. We'll see. Carlos, let's bring you in here. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here, to be with very good friends. I have to say, I agree with Professor Marandi on this. And of course, we, Tricontinental, we've been working the last couple of years on this text on hyper-imperialism, in the way we sort of address this moment of time that imperialism is undergoing. I mean, the United States has lost that control, that hegemony that it seemed to have after the end of the Cold War, and you can see that the whole a whole different set of things that have been going on in the world. That the rise of multilateralism in the form of BRICS, for example, has been contesting the U.S. dominance over even over finance. There's although we haven't overcome or we haven't set up a new system yet. That there's a possibility, and people are looking into a different possible financial system, financial structure. You're seeing countries now trading their own currencies. You've seen other types of trade patterns. ALBA, for example, here in Latin America, is a treaty of cooperation, complementation. You don't require the countries to trade in dollars, in US dollars, in order to have trade. You trade in whatever you can provide, that we can supply to each other. And that defeats that logic of US dominance over world trade. You see the US has lost dominance over scientific development. Now you have China at the head of the production of artificial intelligence. And that's a key element for the future. It's going to be very important. And so the United States, under these conditions, when you see that they no longer control all the resources they used to in the world, they no longer control technological development, they no longer completely control finance, it's starting to become desperate. So this phase of imperialism is a desperate phase. That's why they're so sloppy, like Professor Marandi was saying, that they'll say they no longer want to be careful with how they say things or how they explain. I mean, the fact that Trump for the last couple of months, started a narrative that they're going after drug trafficking in the region, when in fact every world report shows that drug trafficking from Latin America to the United States runs about 90% through the Pacific Ocean, and Venezuela has no coast on the Pacific Ocean. So it wouldn't make any sense that you are actually saying that you're attacking Venezuela, or you have the siege against Venezuela because of drug trafficking. Well, they started with this narrative. Once they realized it didn't work, or they don't really care, and they just grabbed the oil. I mean, the moment they took the tanker, that first tanker, and that we saw it was like a movie. You saw the people coming down from the helicopters and running on the deck with the guns. And by the way, we don't know what happened to the crew of that ship. The crew of a ship that is trading oil and something that's a natural economic activity. That crew has been taken, seized, and we have no idea what was happening to that crew. So they do this and then openly say, they ask President Trump, what are you going to do with the oil? And say, well, we're going to take it. They no longer are this moment of hyper imperialist activity. They no longer care to hide the intentions. They're openly showing the intentions. The intention is to make sure they have a hold on the resources of the world, on the resources they need to maintain the hegemony that they're losing. And in doing so, if they have to take a tanker, they'll do it. Funny, because they couldn't set that up to try to stop a boat with alleged drugs. I mean, why didn't they take over those boats? Why didn't they come with the helicopters and stop them and see if they were carrying drugs? No. That it's all spectacle. They wanted to bomb them and say, no, look how strong we are. We are fighting drug trafficking. So we just killed this whole bunch of people. There, they didn't need to jump into the ship. But when it was oil, then they have all the technology, all the capabilities to come and seize the oil tanker so that they could steal the oil. So this moment that we're living is this desperate form of imperialism. It's very dangerous. I mean, I agree with the fact, of course, we all know that it's a sign of decadence, of empire. But we should be careful, because I think it's probably a most dangerous phase, because it's like a wounded beast. You never know in their last attempts to defend itself where it's going to attack, how it's going to attack. It's working on desperation. So it doesn't have any concern now for international law. It's not going to have any concern for public opinion. It's not going to have any concern for even economic, the damage that could do with economic relations around the world. Even the issue of migration, which is so, they allege is so important. If you have a war in the Caribbean Sea, that's just going to set off a wave of migration that is probably going to mostly impact the United States. But they don't care about that either. They just want control. What we've been seeing in the Western Hemisphere for the last year is that under this new scenario where the U.S. feels like it's losing power, and that its competitors like China or Russia are beginning to show their strength, where what we are seeing is that the United States is trying to reestablish this dominance it used to have, more than 30 years ago over the region of Latin America, when the neoliberal programs were first implemented, and most of the tendencies of the governments at the time were pro-U.S. What they're trying to do is recuperate that space, because that space was lost during the last 25 years or so with after the Bolivarian Revolution started. Then you had a wave of popular governments coming to power in Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, everywhere. And, you have more of an independent Latin America growing out of that. Now they realized this year that, that needs to change in order to guarantee the U.S. own security and guarantee its growth or its hegemony. And I'm not sorry, this is not just an analysis. This is like something that the people of Project 2025, who were part of the Trump campaign, they actually had this in their texts. They talked about re-hemisphering as a necessity for maintaining U.S. Economic strength. It's also, you can read it perfectly in the new national security strategy. They are talking about a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So basically saying, well, we were activating the Monroe Doctrine again, and we can intervene and do whatever we want in any of your countries in Latin America, as long as that means that we're keeping, other powers out. There's definitely a concern from the U.S. that these competitors, or who they seem as competitors, like, again, China, Russia, but also to another extent, and for different reasons, Iran, Cuba, they see it as competing with the U.S. Model. Well, they want to keep these countries sort of out of the control of the region, and they'll do whatever they need to do. You can see, sorry, I have a bit of a cold. You can see how throughout this year, U.S. has interfered in the elections of Argentina. And they basically said to the people of Argentina, if you don't vote for Milei and for his people, we will take away the needed foreign aid for your country and make your economy collapse. They just interfere in the elections in Honduras. Freeing, among other things, a convicted drug trafficker who was the former president of Honduras, who they were looking for, who they had, files against and proofs against drug trafficking. Now they released him, and they used that in order to try to promote the candidacy of one candidate in particular. But we could talk about many other examples. But there's an intervention in other elections. There's an attempt to, the United States wants to take Greenland. It wants to take back the Panama Canal. I mean, it's this rebuilding of Canada, make it a state. Well, then you realize that's what they're building, and that's the moment they're in. So it's a dangerous place, but also I think it's delusional. I mean, when you're in this moment of hyper-imperialism, you're a moment of delusion. They don't understand. They think that the peoples are just going to take these things quietly and not resist and not have other alternatives. And that is what I think they're completely misguided. And that's what I think is going to be the end of this project.
Yeah. Thank you, Carlos. The point you brought up about the danger that we're facing in this moment as the beast, dies, it's becoming more unpredictable and violent, I think, is incredibly true. And along that vein, I guess, I'm wondering what you all think. I asked you about the state of the empire from your particular perspectives, but there's also an incredible anti-imperialist bloc. Virtually every continent, every global South continent has at least one major node of anti-imperialism, if not more. In Asia, we have Russia and China and Iran, plus many, and North Korea, plus many others. In Africa, we have the Alliance of Sahel States now, which is incredibly inspiring, plus others. South Africa, to some extent, through its support of the Palestinians and other efforts. And then we have in the Americas, we have Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and others, more or less. Colombia, seems to go back and forth. So what do you think is the state of anti-imperialist resistance, considering the growing strength of this anti-imperialist bloc right now, if we can even call it that? I'll go back to you, Professor Marandi.
Well, I think probably perhaps it's best to I mean, Russia and China have a different trajectory with the West. Russia wanted to join the West. They wanted to be a part of the West. They wanted to be a part of NATO. President Putin wanted to be a part of NATO and join the club, and the West rejected them. And ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were working to plunder the country and to bring about the collapse of Russia. So Russia's incentive is not the same as Iran and Venezuela, which were more like revolutions and anti-imperialist. But I think Russia has some of the ideals that during the Soviet era. And I don't mean communism, but the global South. The relationship that the Soviet Union had with the global South. It revived some of that, and it tilted towards this, let's say, anti-imperialist trajectory. And so RT, you can see a lot of it in RT and how RT does support hegemonic movements across the world. China is a bit different because it was the United States basically had an ideal relationship with the country. They took their factories there, their businesses there. They made a lot of money there. And when, surprise, surprise, China began to develop, they became angry with China. So they made the money. Their businesses made billions upon billions of dollars by using the cheap labor, using engineers that get lower pay, using the the laws and the regulations of China that were friendly to business. And then when China began to develop and grow itself, then they became hostile towards China. So that was a separate trajectory. But in the case of Iran and Venezuela and some of the other countries that you've named, these were countries that were under Western control, and that they were either colonies in many instances, or they were under the authority of the hegemon. So, for example, as you and I'm sure your guests know, those who are a bit older, Iran was under British domination. And then in 1951, the then Prime Minister, Mossadegh, he nationalized Iranian oil. The public wanted it, the religious and nationalist figures wanted it, and he agreed to it, and he pushed that project forward. But then in 1953, the Americans and the British carried out a coup, and the country was under Western subjugation for a very long period of time. And in the case of Venezuela, we saw after the revolution in Venezuela, they tried to undermine it through a coup, and the popular will prevented them from getting their way. So Iran and Venezuela are sort of countries that have been under the boots of the imperialist powers and were able to revolt and become beacons of liberty. And that's why they're so despised. And that's why you'll never see anything good about Iran or Venezuela said in the Western media. Never. It's not possible. We're always backward. We're always failures. We're always our regimes are unpopular. Our leaders are criminals. And that's just how it is. So it's because of this trajectory. I cannot say that the anti-colonialist movement is gaining strength, because we've seen setbacks in Latin America in particular, and across the world. I don't see many cases like Iran and Venezuela in our region. All of the countries were complicit in the genocide. None of the regional countries, Arabic, non-Arabic, broke off ties with the Israeli regime, military, political, intelligence, economic ties. So, but what gives me optimism is the decline of empire. And the fact that countries like Iran, Venezuela, others, Russia and China are converging. Russia and China are converging with one another, but also with other global South countries. And of course, Iran is a very large country, very powerful country. Venezuela is a very large country, very, it's a wonderful country. It's the part of the Amazon. I mean, I shouldn't be saying this in front of Carlos, but part of the Amazon goes through Venezuela. It's very rich in resources, and the people of Venezuela, of course, are very well educated. After the revolution, a lot of focus was put on education, so there's huge potential in these countries. But now there's a convergence with the rising powers that are being antagonized by the United States. So you have a relative decline in the West. That is what I think is most gives me a lot of optimism. But you also have the emergence of countries that are increasingly being antagonized by the West. Instead of cooperating with these rising countries like China, they suddenly turned against it. Instead of cooperating with the Russians, they antagonize it. And so they brought them together, and they also brought them closer with other countries in the global South. They've also done more recently, we saw what Trump did with India. And to a degree, it also pushed India in the right direction, let's say, or Brazil, for example. So what gives me optimism is the relative decline of the West and the rise of powers in the non-Western world. But there's a shortage of countries like Iran and Venezuela that have revolutionary aspirations, that promote anti-imperialism, and that are willing to pay the price. And they are paying the price. Sometimes in the United States, they tell me, when I speak about Venezuela, and the same about Iran, but they say, look at you've read this how the economic model of Venezuela has failed. Now, whether it's failed or not, that's another conversation. But I always tell them, you put your boots on someone's neck and then you say, look, he can't breathe. Look, she can't breathe. And well, of course, when you put your boot on someone's neck, it's the circumstances change. So I am optimistic. And I think that what we're seeing today, both with Venezuela and Iran, and the way in which the United States is outraged and angry, is reflective of its inability to undermine these countries. Although I think we have to stress time and time again what Carlos said, that a wounded animal is very dangerous. And the United States could possibly do some very stupid things in Venezuela and do lots of mass killings just to say that we won when they failed. Or in our part of the world, these are people who have carried out a genocide for well over 2 years and are still carrying out the genocide. The collective West, we see how they're justifying genocide. That's something unique in human history, carrying out genocide in front of the eyes of the world for well over 2 years and keep telling us that they're doing the right thing. That's the madness of this empire at play. But despite that, I think that Venezuela will overcome, Iran will overcome, and the Israeli regime will fail, the U.S. empire in general will fail, but it will probably come at a cost to many people across the world, innocent people, as we see those in the boats in Venezuela. But those are not even the worst victims, I should add, because the people who die in the boats are people who we can see them being murdered. The people who die due to sanctions, we never even think of them as victims. Let's say someone has cancer in Venezuela or Cuba or Iran, and then for whatever reason, that very expensive medicine has become much more expensive because it's difficult to import it. You can't use the banking system. They lie when they say they allow you to use the banking system for medicine, and they don't. That's just for media. And the media knows it, but they repeat the lies, Western media. So someone in Venezuela has cancer, someone in Iran has diabetes or something, and then something that they need is not available for 3 months. That person is destined to die. Especially these children who nowadays, who let's say have cancer, they can be cured in many instances, if not most, yet they die. And that's what's happening in Gaza, by the way. The deaths in Gaza are probably in the hundreds of thousands Because if you look at those who die of cancer, those who die of illness, or those who die, and you add them to those whose bodies have been found, God knows what the real numbers are. So the victims are not just the people who die in the boats and we have images of them. The victims are those little kids in hospitals who die and we just count them as deaths, whereas they would not have died if it had not been for the United States.
Carlos, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I mean, I agree with my friend Professor Marandi. I mean, I think that one of the difficulties that we have at this moment is also, when we think about overcoming this imperialism or this setup where we're currently at, we see resistance, but there's not a necessarily a common project or a common alternative project. That's perhaps, I mean, there could be a big debate over whether we need a common project or if we need, to have a diverse possibility of projects. But in any case, it shows that not having a clear alternative is part of the reason why it's difficult to see an actual transformation, an actual end to the imperialist project. And it's easy to reverse sometimes some of the advances. I mean, Latin America, in this last couple of years, you've seen, some trends, not agreeing on the path forward allows divisions to come in and allows the extreme right, imperialist right to come in and take over. So those are the things that we need to think about collectively. At the same time, we've had examples throughout history that could guide us through. There's we call the spirit of Bandung. How the world, almost more than half a century ago, but people came together from the South, the global South. The Asians, some Latin Americans, mostly Cubans at that moment in time, but Africa, to find ways to find an alternative path and build an alternative path forward. Next year will be the 60th anniversary of the Tricontinental Conference in Havana, which was a very specific moment where you saw this connection of people fighting against colonialist struggle and trying to find a common path forward. We have advances. We have instances like BRICS, for example, that are trying to build some alternatives. It's not the same, of course. I'm not trying to say the Bandung and BRICS are the same. There's different. There were different spirits, I would say, different objectives. But I think that moving towards a better dialogue of those anti-imperialist forces, those anti-colonial forces, is necessary, so that we could really have a new project. And if we go back to in Venezuelan history, we always like to discuss the vision that Simón Bolívar had. Next year will also be the 200th anniversary of the Panama Congress, which was basically his initiative to have Latin American countries unite into one multilateral space. And the interesting element of this proposal is that he spoke about the equilibrium of the universe. And what I like about that notion is that he didn't say, well, we all have to be this one way or the other. He said the powers around the world must find a way to balance their interests, and so that no one would trample upon the interests of the other. No one would overcome, the other. In a world that, may be idealistic, but in a world that I think we should be trying to build, this is a world where we have that equilibrium, where we find that we can respect diversity, we can respect the diverse types of civilizations that have been created, but also that one doesn't overpower the other, but actually live in respectful harmony. And I think that is something that we still need to build. But I am also faithful. Like I agree with Marandi in the sense that the peoples of the world know that imperialism is not the future of humanity. With imperialism, if we continue to exploit the resources in that way, to continue to have these endless wars, we're not going to have a planet very soon. And I think that's something that most of the peoples of the world have realized and in their everyday lives are resisting.
Yeah, I think you're both right. On the one hand, if you scan the world and what's happening, it feels almost like U.S. imperialism is falling too fast for the nations of the world to get organized and rise up to take over, right? But it is falling, and it's attacking its friends as it's falling, not just its enemies. And so, on the other hand, I think the sort of upside of it is that nations like Venezuela and Iran stand as beacons, as Dr. Marandi said, and are organizing, right? They're organizing with their colleagues around the world.
And they're cooperating with each other.
And they're cooperating with each other, yeah. Yeah. The time pressure, the other aspect that, Carlos, you brought up is the time pressure, right? The dying planet is something that we've never had to deal with. And so as dire as the potential consequences of that are, my hope is that that particular pressure is going to accelerate collaboration and camaraderie among the nation states of the world. So speaking specifically along the lines of what Dr. Marandi just mentioned on Venezuela and Iran, there's a truly comrade-like relationship and a friendship between these two nations that are by and large similarly situated in many ways, economically, politically. And I would love to hear what you both think about this comradely relationship, and also, feel free in that context to tie in the hybrid war, the very violent, very aggressive hybrid war that both nations face, right? So when I say hybrid war, what I mean is cyber war, strikes, sort of classical warfare like what Iran just experienced with the 12-day war, sanctions, elections interference, the use of the dollar and currency devaluation, which both nations are right now actively facing. So feel free to tie that in, and then also maybe the sort of the beautiful self-reliance that has emerged. I think I just read yesterday that Venezuela is now the strongest, or this year, one of the strongest economies in Latin America. I regularly read about Iran's development. I'm sorry?
I think it was 6.5%, if I'm not mistaken. I read
somewhere.
Wow,
that's amazing.
Despite all what the United States is doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, one reason is,
Iran too.
I shouldn't be saying this, but Carlos should. But during the recent years, Venezuela has been able to diversify its economy, and even though the United States is blocking oil and stealing oil, like the regime being like the thief that it is, but if it had done so a decade ago or a decade and a half ago, it would have been, I think, much more difficult for Venezuela. Yeah. But they have succeeded in many ways in decreasing dependence on oil. Again, it's tough for Venezuela. And one of the things actually that I think that makes Iran, well, first of all, Iran and Venezuela helped each other in the past. More recently, the Iranians helped the Venezuelans when the United States was targeting their electricity and their oil and refineries. But before that, when the Iranians were facing the first wave of maximum pressure sanctions under Obama, and we were facing a lot of difficulties, Venezuela assisted Iran. So the two countries have been helping one another during during the last couple of decades in the face of the empire. But also, in addition to that, I think there is a strong element of social justice in Iran and Venezuela. After the revolution in Iran, universal literacy became a key component. I visited in Venezuela too. I visited the government university that was created, massive, and also healthcare in Venezuela too. Like Iran developed a very sophisticated healthcare network, which Iran learned some of it from Cuba. In the 1980s, at the beginning of the revolution, senior health officials from Iran went and visited Cuba on multiple occasions to learn from their experience. And you see how these countries are sort of, I mean, I'm not saying Venezuela or Iran are in an ideal situation, but when you take into account the antagonism, the sanctions, the sheer terror that is imposed on people by the United States and its proxies and allies, I think it's fair to say that these two countries have had a lot of success. And one reason for these sanctions, as I said earlier, is obviously to make people desperate and kneel, but another is to make sure they don't succeed. Because if Venezuela or Iran succeeds, then other people will do it. So both through propaganda and misinformation and disinformation, but also through the sanctions, they try to make sure that these do not become attractive models elsewhere. And so for example, in the case of Iran, it's always collapsing, it's evil, the mullahs are killing people. I'm doing this program on Al Mayadeen television in English, and it's on their English, Mayadeen English, the X or Twitter and YouTube, and I don't have Instagram and Facebook. I've been kicked out of them a long time ago. But if they go to Mayadeen English, I have a show called Demystifying Iran. It's a monologue that I've been doing for a few weeks now, and I deal with some of these issues. But if people want to see how they represent Iran and the reality, maybe that could be helpful. But in the case of Venezuela, they present it as this communist dystopia. Religion in Venezuela, from my personal experience in Venezuela and from my limited experience in Europe, religiosity in Venezuela is much more important in Venezuela than in Europe. Yet Venezuela is somehow this communist, anti-God, and in Venezuela, you have the private sector and you have the public sector. You have business people, and in fact, many of those wealthy people are part of the problem, just like in Iran. But you have the private sector, you have the public sector. It's not at all in any way or form similar to the fake narratives that are being produced in the West, whether it's about Iran or Venezuela.
Also, I think it's important that imperialism is ideology based on arrogance, and something that they really don't understand is that we have countries that are not going to just sit by and idle and just suffer whatever attacks they come. People they don't understand that people become creative, and resistance is a form of creativity. And like you said, now Venezuela is growing the food that it used to import before because of oil economy. Now is the sanctions sort of help improve Venezuela's food production, but also countries are going to also cooperate and see that if they both they have a shared attack, they also have shared ideas of how to overcome them and how to produce results for their people. And I can't stop mentioning that every time I remember that when we were blocked from buying vaccines and medical supplies during the pandemic, it was countries like Iran who came out to help Venezuela and provided. We had a diplomat that was arrested and kidnapped by the United States precisely as he was heading to Iran to find medication and other supplies for Venezuela to deal with the pandemic. So, we'll always have a long history, I think, in particular Venezuela and Iran, of cooperation. It began many years ago, even before, the current ideological processes that we're in. When OPEC started, we were, as oil producing countries, the two countries were there and worked together. So it's a strong relationship of countries that know what colonialism is, that know what imperialist aggression is, but also know what creativity and resistance are. And that I think it's important that even today, we have a very strong relationship with Iran, based on shared efforts to improve the lives of people. There's an important cooperation in agriculture, because people are always trying to say, oh, they're cooperating in military aspects, or they're cooperating in oil. But, nobody talks to you about how we cooperate in agriculture, how there's been technology transfer. Go see if any of those imperialist states in the United States or in Europe do technology transfers to developing countries, and in order for them to improve food consumption and food production. They don't do that. But countries that know what struggling is, they do. And they do share technology, and they do share methods to improve how to make people's lives better. So, that if there's any good side to the imperialist attack, is that people are drawn to each other, and for resistance and for creativity and for the improvement of lives of their own people.
I would just add that Iran and Venezuela, but also other countries, people have lots of shared values. The problem with empire is that they don't want to share anything. They don't have any values to share with us. Because when you look down upon the rest of the world, when you look at other people, the whole notion of the United States considering Latin America and the Americas as its backyard, it's unacceptable. How can you have any shared values with such an entity that basically says, the majority here, they do what I say. They take my interests into account, and I take my interests into account. How can you have shared values with such an entity? I'm not talking about ordinary Americans. I'm not talking about ordinary Germans or ordinary people in France. I'm talking about the states. The empire doesn't have any interest in our well-being, in our welfare, in the education of our children, the survival of our children. Again, all you have to do is go back to the footage for over the last 2 years in Gaza, and we know exactly what the empire is. It is ruthless, it is brutal, and it is inhumane. But the rest of the world, that's not how we see things. Venezuela has never invaded any neighboring country. Even though the United States uses neighboring countries to provoke Venezuela, Venezuela has always shown restraint. The same is true with Iran. They've invaded Iran using Saddam Hussein as their proxy, but Iran has never invaded any other country. So I think these mutual values, these similar interests, and of course both Iran and Venezuela are cursed by the very fact that they have natural resources. I remember years ago reading this cartoon, and the two men were digging the ground, and then suddenly oil pops out, and one says, "Quick, cover it. The Americans are going to invade if they see there's any oil here." So in a sense, we are being punished because of the natural resource, the wealth that these two countries have.
Marandi, you mentioned that, and it's funny because I was thinking the other day how when Trump started saying that the Venezuelan oil was his oil and these things, how that also comes from it's a legacy of imperialism and of that mentality and ideology. See, in Venezuela, the discovery of oil, or what before they knew it was oil, it was, what was coming out of the ground was done by indigenous communities, and they would use them they would use what would come out as for some remedies for pains and sores and all these and things for to sort of use for the fires that they were building right before all the processing came through. Then in the late 19th century, when processing starts coming out and then all these things and the first concessions or anything. Well, throughout all of the history of Venezuela, there was, even since Bolivar, there was the criteria that whatever is found on the ground belongs to the people or is for the nation to be exploited for the nation. This is very different from the notion of what oil was for the United States. And the best way to prove that is to see American cartoons, the U.S. cartoons. You always have these the running around and all of a sudden they strike oil and this oil gushes out of the land and the character becomes rich. The cartoon character becomes rich. That's impossible. That would never happen in our frame of mind because it's always been a collective wealth,
natural resource, a national resource,
right? But it's only in this idea of this romanticized, idea of the West, and particularly the United States, that this is sort of a source of wealth. That if you find oil, this is something you grab and take because this can be yours. And that is the cowboy mentality that they have now. I mean, and if you look at, there's like a set of narrative, or they say that there's like a 7 traditional themes in Western movies, and one of those themes is striking oil. And it used to be this: well, you become rich all of a sudden, and then these problems that come out of that, whatever. But again, this is in the psyche of imperialism. That this is something that is up for grabs for anybody, not that this belongs to a nation.
They don't even share values with their own people, because
right.
this is individualism. It's all about the individual. In the case of Venezuela and Iran, you have individuality. People, there is the private sector. People have their own private sphere, but also you have the public sphere, and these natural resources that are so key to the wealth of nations are for the general public. But in the United States, it's all about me. It's all about the capitalist. It's all about that individual. So how can we have shared values with a hegemonic entity that is, even in its own society, it is utterly selfish? So when they look at Venezuelan oil, they're not looking, or Iranian oil or gas or whatever, they're not looking at shared interests. They're looking at their share, and their share is not America's share. It's the share of those oligarchs in the United States or European oligarchs who are going to become filthy rich, as you alluded to in the cartoons, and ordinary people in the West, even they're not a part of this model. So that's why I think capitalism is destined to fail, just like Soviet communism failed because it was on the other extreme, and it failed to recognize the individual, and someone works harder or someone wants to have their own private sphere. They to a large degree, not completely, but negated individuality. In the West, not completely, but to a large degree, they ignore society and societal interests. I mean, the United States, again, I know less about the United States than you do, but when I was in the United States as a child, it was a much wealthier society. The bridges were good, the roads were good. It was what China is becoming today, or what China has become today. But the more this individualism and the selfishness increased, and I think a lot of it actually had to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because since the Soviet Union collapsed, they no longer had to worry about their workers. They no longer had to worry about people tilting towards communism or the Eastern Bloc. So they began to take away the what they had, whether it's healthcare or free education, that they began to increasingly take it away from the working class, the middle class. And then you had, in the United States, for example, during the Clinton years, deregulation and the gradual removal of these laws to prevent monopolies. And so gradually you had more and more wealth consolidation among the rich. And again, ordinary Americans are to suffer. And have no doubt that if in their wildest dreams they are able to undermine Iran and Venezuela, which they won't, but if they do succeed, do you think that wealth is going to go to ordinary Americans? No, it's going to go into the pockets of the oligarchs and their entourage.
Yeah. In fact, the Forbes magazine issues a billionaire report every year. And right now there are more billionaires in the world than ever before. And the overwhelming majority of them are located in the United States. So there's a direct relationship. There's a causal relationship between the falling bridges and the rat infested schools in the United States and the wealth of these billionaires. And I think Elon Musk, I'm not sure about this, but I think the most recent research is that Elon Musk is now the wealthiest man to ever walk the planet, which is
bizarre.
It's just, I mean, in this day, it's just, anyways. I know some of us have to run, so I'm gonna maybe give everybody an opportunity to offer final words. Maybe something we should be beware of in the coming years, something we should look forward to in the coming years. What do you, as Venezuelans and Iranians, want of the anti-imperialist left in the United States? Yeah, anything or anything else that comes to mind.
I think, and I'll leave the last words to Carlos. I think that in the United States, there is a great deal of ignorance and lack of knowledge about the broader world, and that when people say "Yankee go home" or when their chants of "Death to America," it's not about Yankee go home, meaning the ordinary citizen take your passport and go home. It means the regime in Washington should leave these countries alone. Just like in Iran, when they chant slogans, "Death to America," they mean the empire. They mean the regime that has been tormenting the country for so many decades. People in my experience, I mean, I haven't been to most countries in the world, obviously, but I've been to Venezuela a few times and I live in Iran. I've never seen, even among the more revolutionary people in these two countries, I've never seen any hostility towards the United States as a country with 50 states. I've never seen any hostility towards people who are American passport holders. The problem is that the United States as an empire is actually very similar to the Israeli regime. It sees the rest of humanity as subordinate, as inferior, less human, and thus anything goes. The Israelis, they carry out a Holocaust in Gaza. They'll do it wherever they want. The West justifies it. And then the West increasingly becomes more like it. And that's why we see, I think, even though empire has been around for hundreds of years and they've carried out all sorts of genocides, but in the more recent instances, and correct me if I'm wrong, Carlos, I really think that the crudeness of U.S. behavior in Latin America, the bombing of these boats, is somewhat linked to what happened in Gaza. By killing people on TV, by killing people online, we see it on the internet, in social media, in your emails or whatever. They've normalized it, and so killing Venezuelans or others from the Caribbean on these boats becomes much more easy. They've dehumanized people in the global South so much that it really doesn't resonate. It doesn't. They don't feel like the people that they're murdering, they have kids. that they have parents, they have a wife waiting for them at home, or maybe a husband waiting at home. They've dehumanized everyone so much that they don't even tell you that today you won't hear this in Western media, that they murdered a fisherman off the coast of Gaza today, among other people that they murdered today, just so that they can starve people more. They're not allowed. During the genocide, they were preventing food from getting in, and they pretended that it was because of the war. Now there's a ceasefire, but they still prevent food to get in. They want people to shiver in the cold, and for infants to die, because they want them to die. They want to cut the Palestinian population, and by doing this, in front of a global audience, which is unprecedented. I mean, we know the crimes that had taken place in human history, but never before have we seen such a crime take place in front of a global audience in this way, and for well over 2 years. And I think the behavior, the crude behavior, the murderous behavior towards ordinary Venezuelans and people from other Latin American countries is linked to this behavior that they were a part of and continue to be a part of in Gaza.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think that that is something terrible. A terrible sign of these times is that dehumanization. That you could really stand through. To me, before this genocide in Gaza, or this recent phase of the genocide in Gaza, because it's very old, of course. But you would think that humanity had overcome the great atrocities of history, from what happened in Nazi Germany to the conquest of the Americas. You think that those things were only things that you would read about in books and never hear of them again. And you see the viciousness of the things that went on, or still going on in Gaza. These attacks, the lack of humanity, which is very, very disturbing and frightening. And then at the same time, you have the other aspect. You have the resurgence of solidarity. You have the resurgence of people coming together to resist and to withstand. And then surprising acts of resistance and moving forward.
Including in 2020,
including in the West.
Yeah.
Including in the West. I mean, I have to say that, despite all the attacks that we received from the U.S. as a state, like Professor Marandi says, I mean, seeing the streets of New York, and I mean, over 60 cities, a couple of weekends ago, in the United States, people coming out to the streets and saying, we don't want a war with Venezuela. The same way, thousands of people came out, during the whole of last year in defense of Gaza. You realize, that there is hope in solidarity, in internationalism. These are values that we can't lose. And I see a 2026 with more internationalism, more solidarity coming out, and tipping always the scale in our favor. I think that what's going to happen in the U.S. is, it's also a year that's important. It's an election year. It's a year of, a lot of tension. And that people, the more and more these atrocities happen, yes, it's dehumanizing from the elites, but it's also conscience raising for the masses and for the popular organizations. And I think, and I hope that we see more of that moving forward in the next year.
Sure.
Thank you both very much. This was a wonderful discussion, really thoughtful and inspiring in many ways. I'll just end on a special note. Hamas and the Palestinian resistance over the last few days I think yesterday, released the image of Abu Ubaidah, the widely loved figure of the resistance. We'd never seen his face before, but now that after his assassination, we are privileged enough to see his face. They also released the images of his children that were assassinated with him, and so I encourage
His
And
wife
his
was
wife.
also assassinated.
I haven't seen the images of his wife
No,
yet, but I saw
but the entire family was
the
murdered.
whole family
Just
was
like
killed.
when the Israelis
Yeah,
attacked Iran, they would bomb apartment buildings and kill everyone in
yeah,
the building just to get one person. And then Western media would call these precision strikes because those kids and those families are worth nothing to them.
yeah, yeah. And so I encourage everybody to go and read the narrative that the Palestinian resistance and Hamas issued over the weekend. Go and look at the videos that they've issued and honor this Palestinian resistance that has, in the face of the most destructive genocide in our time, because it was live streamed before our faces, they have resisted. I think they are a model for us all. So thank you all very much. Thank you to Carlos. Thank you to Dr. Marandi. Thank you as always.